Hi, everyone, and welcome to Adult Bible Studies. I'm Wayne Williams, and it's my privilege to share this time with you today. We're starting into the third lesson of a unit of lessons where we're looking at how we participate in God's work through our actions. 2 weeks ago, we looked at how we receive God's love and grace into our lives. And because of that love and because of its impact on us, we not only internalize that love, but we become instruments of that love in the world around us. And one of the early characteristics of the church was that they were people of love. They were people who cared. They cared deeply about one another, but they also cared about others. They cared about justice and peace, and they cared about those quality elements that affect everyone. Love is a way that we act out our faith. Last week we looked at the light of God, and we talked about how God has illuminated us in the sense of making us aware of the areas where we're not quite on track and we need to change and need to refocus our energies and be better people with God's guidance and God's support. And He illuminates that pathway for us. His Spirit guides us and directs us. And because of that, we can become reflections of His light, reflecting the light of God. And we talked about how light is such a pure and beautiful symbol of God because it dispels darkness. And we always kind of associate darkness with evil and with the things that are not good things of our world. But light dispels that, pushes it away. And they can't coexist together with one another. And so we become people of light. We shed light, we share insights, we share things that, as a human being, my focus is pretty strongly on me. Some of my favorite words are I, me, my, mine. And God's Spirit comes to me and touches me, and He says, Wayne, you're important, and we want you to understand that that's fine, but you're not all important. You're not all that it's about. And it's about sharing that understanding of self and of God's love and of God's grace with other people, being a light, a source of inspiration, a source of hope to other people. Well, this week we're going to draw aside and look at a book that we don't look at very much in the Bible, James, the book of James. James is not a very long book, but it's a very powerful book. It has a lot of very direct kinds of statements in it where the author is writing to people. He says to the 12 tribes of Israel who are dispersed, who are outside of the homeland of Palestine and Israel and Jerusalem. And he's writing to them to give them some guidance on what are the parameters of the Christian lifestyle. And it's because of that, it is a very direct book. It has a lot of just very direct kind of guidance in it. And some people read it and say, well, this book really doesn't have much of a theme to it, but it has a lot of wisdom to it. And yet it does have a theme. And the theme, that connects it all together is that Christians, when we combine our faith with actions, we can practice a true devotion to God. Actions and faith go together. The two enhance. Show me your works without your faith, and I'll show you my faith by my works. Important thoughts for us as people today. There's a little dispute over whether James, the brother of Jesus, who became a leader in the Jerusalem church after Jesus' resurrection, is the author of this book. Maybe he is the one who edited it, put it together. Maybe it contains a lot of his thoughts, but it also contains thoughts from other people of his day and time, and he shares those. I don't want to get into all that really, except for us to understand that it was written in that early church period where the church was really grappling with what it meant to be God's people. And James is a very direct book in addressing that. This morning we're going to look at verses 19 through 27 of chapter 1 in James. In this section we find three different things that he exhorts us to do. First of all, he says he exhorts us to be careful about our speech and our speech behavior. Second thing is he wants us to see that hearing and doing go hand in hand. And lastly, he wants us to see that a true, pure religion is one that involves faith and works. So let's look at this passage together. I'm going to start out with verses 19 through 21. Know this, my dear brothers and sisters. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to grow angry. That's that first verse, verse 19. See what I mean by very direct? Doesn't leave much room for doubt what he's talking about, does he? Know this. I'm telling you, this is the truth. Know this. Brothers and sisters, people who are accountable before God and people who are accountable to one another, people who are of love and grace and of God's illumination. Listen. Listen carefully. Learn to listen. Teach yourself to listen. In my counseling training, I remember one of the early classes we had to do an interview and had to tape it. And in this interview, we were not to say any more than we just absolutely had to. We'd say, tell me what brings you to see me today. And then as the person, some people are real chatty and they just kind of go and go and go. Some people you have to kind of pull things out of them a little bit. So you may have to ask some directive kinds of questions like, I'm not sure I understand. Can you explain a little more? Can you give me a little more information? And trying to do that in a way that you're not passing judgment on anything that they're saying, but allowing them simply to express themselves. Listening is a really tough skill to master. And a 20-minute interview where you say just a very minimum, the old cliche about counselors is, and how does that make you feel, is a part of that. How, that's our concern, is how does the other person really feel? Are we listening to that other person to hear the underlying truths of what's important to them? Listen. Then, if you must, if you can, if you have something that adds to the situation, speak, but speak slowly. When you speak, let it be an informed speech that comes out of and in response to the situation and the person you're dealing with. And then lastly, it says, and be slow to anger. Anger is an emotion that gets in the way, isn't it? It's also an emotion that's very understandable. I mean, there's anger. It is possible to have righteous anger and to be upset at something that really is inappropriate. And yet, there's also a sense that when we entertain that feeling of anger, when we allow those emotions to rage, we drop our guard. And if we don't watch it, it can become part of our everyday lifestyle and way of interacting with other people. We can always kind of have a chip on our shoulder. We can always be kind of looking for something to pick at or make something up. And that's not good listening. And certainly that doesn't enable the other person to hear us when we speak. Watch that anger. He goes on and he says, this is because an angry person doesn't produce God's righteousness. It's hard when you're angry to speak. Sometimes it's better to take a time out. Sometimes I tell couples in counseling, maybe you need to agree to take a time out. Now, I make it very clear that they don't need to just take a time out and try to blow off the problem and never get back to it. But sometimes the emotions are so strong that they get in the way, and it's necessary to take a little downtime to get that going. Well, It's hard to produce righteousness. It's hard to come to a solution when you're angry and upset. Therefore, with humility, here's that very direct uh, advice and counsel that James gives. With humility, set aside all moral filth and growth of wickedness, and welcome the word planted deep inside of you, the very word that is able to save you. Two good ideas here. First of all, avoid those things that are not pure, that are not just, that are not appropriate. This old world throws all kinds of stuff at us all the time, and we can't help but be impacted by that. And yet, in humility, sort those things out, push those things away, and focus yourself on the Word of God, which you can plant deep into your heart and which you can use as a reference point. And when you hear something in the world that you know is not so or that you question, go back to God's Word to confirm it or to decide how you're going to react to that. Be slow to speak. Listen. That's a dynamic part of being God's people and being involved in the activeness of our faith, which is the second point that we go to when we look at starting with verse 22. You must be doers of the word and not only hearers who mislead themselves. You need to be from Missouri. Show me. Don't just tell me. Show me. Around here we say it, practice what you preach. We get it, don't we? We understand that. James is being very direct. Be doers of the word and not hearers only. It's possible to hear instruction and then just blow it off and go on and not do anything with it. It has been really worthless for someone to have shared that with you or for you to have read that information or whatever. We have a choice, don't we, when we receive information, when we receive insight. How are we going to use that? Are we going to apply it? Or are we just going to say, well, that's nice to know and put it on the shelf? If you put it on the shelf, it ain't going to keep. It's going to spoil. And it's not going to be there when you need it because you've never applied it, you've never tested it, you've never used it. You don't have any confidence in it. And that's what James is talking about here. Build your confidence by acting on those things that you hear. My son is a teacher in a technical school, and he says he will lecture for a little while, but then they will go out into the workshop and do what he's been talking about. And that doubly reinforces that doing and hearing. And lots of times when they come back in from the workshop, they've got questions they didn't even know they had during the time that he was initially presenting the material. It's that way in life. It's that way in our Christian lives. When we hear and we think we understand, but we put it into action and maybe it doesn't quite work out like we thought, it lets us go back and reconsider and restudy and confirm that so that we come to that word of truth planted deep inside of us that helps with those actions. Those who hear but don't do the word are like those who look at their faces in a mirror. They look at themselves, walk away, and immediately forget what they are like. But there are those who study the perfect law of freedom and continue to do it. They don't listen and forget, but they put it into practice in their lives. They will be blessed in whatever they do. Looking in a mirror, liking what you see. Hey, look at that one. He's a pretty good looking fellow. Yeah. But then walking away and letting that self-esteem fall away, letting that self-image fall away, let that sense of expectation of who we're to be fall away. This is not narcissism here. Narcissus drank from a quiet pool, and as he did, he saw his reflection and he fell in love with his reflection. And he was captivated by that and frozen in place. This is not talking about that kind of being caught up in ourselves and in our image. It's talking about not really seeing. You know, you go to church and you hear a really good sermon, let's say. The preacher really gets on your toes, and you feel it, and you're thinking while you're listening to him, that's right. I've got to start being a little more careful in that area of my life. I've got to start, I need to do something. And yet, when we walk out of the sanctuary and get in our car and go home, the idea gets weaker and weaker until by Monday morning it really has no impact on us in our lifestyles at all. That's that person who looks in the mirror and observes themselves for a moment, but then doesn't take that observation and really do something concrete with it that makes a lasting difference. James says, if you will take the time, if you will put in the energy, if you will be consistent enough to try your ways and to put those together, if you don't put into practice the things that are going on, then here's a little beatitude. They will be blessed with whatever they do. God can bless us when we're acting and when we're doing. God's not afraid of us messing up. He says, practice it, try it. How many skills have you instantaneously learned? Not many in my boat. I've had to practice and practice, sometimes many, many, many times, and still not became real proficient at some things. And yet, the practice is where it gets reinforced and over again. And that's what James is talking about here with their spiritual lives. Lastly, he says, this faith, putting faith in what you hear, listening carefully, receiving the message, applying it, using it, leads to a true religion. There's a lot of religious fake out there, isn't there? People are religious about all kinds of things. They get zealous over all kinds of things. Right now, we've got all these political ads, and people are just picking out their own points and hammering those. And it's frustrating and sometimes because you wish they wouldn't pick just one. You wish they'd really talk about who they are and what kind of principles guide them and how we can anticipate them to react to maybe something that hadn't even arisen yet as an issue. Uh, James says here, those who claim devotion to God don't uh, if those who claim devotion to God don't control what they say, they mislead themselves. Their devotion is worthless. Worthless. I don't like the sounds of that, do you? I like it when God gives me credit for an honest attempt. And yet what James is talking about here is not an honest attempt. He's talking about just going through the motions. Just showing up at church and putting an X in the box and say, okay, God, I went to church this week. Instead of going with your heart open and your mind open and your spirit, seeking to engage God's spirit. True devotion, he says, the kind that is pure and faultless before God the Father, is this: to care for orphans and widows in their difficulties and to keep the world from contaminating us. Now, widows and orphans are not the only people that we are to show compassion for and to be sensitive to. They're just a good example. And what James is saying, if you really have the heart of love, if you really have that illuminating inspiration of God in your life and you're trying to represent God's love and presence, then it shows in the things that you do and the things that you value a person more than their position. Did you treat this person the same as you treat this person, even though this person may have something that they can really offer to you in return? This person has nothing but just needs help. Being able to see each of them as God's children, as people that God loves, and being able to share with them equally and to respond to those needs. To understand that you can't talk about spiritual things when you have so many physical needs. Sometimes you need to do that. And the church has been good about doing this kinds of things. Food pantries and homeless shelters and all sorts of other ministries like that. The point of those ministries is to meet those physical needs so that then the spiritual needs can be addressed. Power in doing. I remember a little church we used to go to. Our song director loved that song, Power in the Blood. Would you or evil a victory win? There's wonderful power in the blood. And he would go, there is power, 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 wonder working power. And we would all kind of laugh, and it would break the tension a little bit, but it would also get us into the spirit of the song. It's about God's power, God's love, and He empowers you and I. He informs us, and then He transforms us, as the lesson title says today. The purpose is to better understand the relationship between belief and practice. What a powerful lesson. James has been real good in talking real straight to us. Do we have ears to hear? Is our mind and heart attuned to God so that we can receive the message and look for application? I pray that you'll have a wonderful week this week. God bless you in all that you do. May you be that instrument of His love, that illumination of His light, and one who practices what they preach so that what they say can be heard in its completeness. God bless you.